You've done everything right. You've analyzed your past relationships, identified patterns, perhaps even worked with a therapist. Yet somehow, you find yourself repeating the same relationship dynamics that have caused you pain before. The faces change, but the story remains eerily similar. What invisible force keeps pulling you back into these familiar patterns, despite your conscious intentions to create something different? Sigmund Freud proposed an answer both elegant and unsettling. A single childhood experience, often forgotten or seemingly insignificant, can create a psychological fixation that shapes our adult romantic choices. This isn't just another theory about how childhood affects adulthood. It's a specific concept suggesting that particular moments become emotional anchors around which our entire romantic lives organize themselves, often without our awareness. Freud called this phenomenon fixation, describing how psychological development could become arrested at a particular point, causing a person to remain unconsciously attached to that developmental stage or experience. While modern psychology has moved beyond many of Freud's specific claims, contemporary research increasingly validates his core insight. Singular emotional experiences can create lasting imprints that shape adult behavior patterns, particularly in intimate relationships. What makes this concept particularly powerful is its specificity. It's not just that your childhood generally influences your adult relationships, it's that specific experiences create specific relationship patterns. A single moment of rejection, betrayal, loss, or even excessive gratification can create a template that unconsciously guides whom you're attracted to and how you behave in relationships decades later. The most powerful fixation points typically occur during what Freud called psychosexual development, not just sexual development in the narrow sense, but the broader formation of identity, attachment, and emotional patterns. Contemporary developmental psychology frames these periods as critical windows when the brain is particularly receptive to forming lasting neural patterns based on emotional experiences. What makes these fixation points so influential is that they don't operate primarily through conscious memory. Many occur before we develop the capacity for explicit autobiographical memory, typically before age 3 or 4. Others get pushed into the unconscious because they were too painful or confusing to integrate consciously. This explains why simply remembering and analyzing past experiences often doesn't change the patterns they created. Even when we can recall these pivotal moments, we rarely recognize their significance. What seems in retrospect like an ordinary childhood disappointment, a normal parental failure, or a common childhood fear may have landed with particular emotional impact at a crucial developmental moment. The conscious mind dismisses what the emotional brain recorded as foundational. Consider some common fixation points and how they manifest in adult relationships. The child who experienced a beloved parent or caregiver suddenly becoming emotionally unavailable, whether through depression, illness, the birth of a sibling, or external stressors, often develops a fixation around emotional abandonment. In adult relationships, this manifests as intense anxiety when a partner seems distant or preoccupied, triggering desperate attempts to reconnect or preemptive withdrawal to protect against anticipated abandonment. A child who received excessive praise for achievements but little acknowledgement for their inherent worth often develops a fixation around performance. Their adult relationships become contexts for proving their value through caretaking, sexual performance, financial provision, or other achievements. Love feels conditional, something that must be earned rather than freely given and received. The child who witnessed a parent's infidelity or betrayal may develop a fixation around trust, whether manifesting as hypervigilance about potential betrayal or, paradoxically, selection of partners who are obviously untrustworthy. Either response represents an attempt to master the original trauma, either by preventing its recurrence through constant monitoring or by controlling when and how the inevitable betrayal occurs. Children who experienced intrusive or boundary-violating parenting often develop fixations around autonomy and control. In adult relationships, They may become rigidly self-sufficient, experiencing normal interdependence as threatening, or they might unconsciously select controlling partners, recreating the familiar dynamic of boundary violation they're trying to master. What makes these patterns particularly confusing is that they often operate through what analysts call reaction formation, developing conscious attitudes or behaviors opposite to the unconscious fixation. The child who felt neglected might consciously reject neediness, priding themselves on self-sufficiency, while unconsciously selecting partners who will recreate the original neglect. The child who experienced intrusion might consciously value independence while unconsciously creating situations where others must take care of them. These contradictions between conscious intentions and unconscious patterns explain why insight alone rarely creates change. You can recognize intellectually that you consistently choose emotionally unavailable partners because your parent was emotionally unavailable, yet still feel powerfully drawn to precisely such partners. The fixation operates beneath the level of conscious choice, creating attraction patterns that feel natural rather than learned. Neuroscience helps explain this disconnect between knowledge and behavior. Emotional learning involves different brain systems than factual learning. A child who experienced a frightening abandonment develops neural pathways connecting attachment with fear. These pathways operate automatically, triggering physiological stress responses to separation or potential abandonment long before conscious thought processes engage. The emotional brain doesn't distinguish between past and present, between the parent who left for a business trip decades ago and the partner who's late coming home from work today. It responds to pattern matches, similar situations that trigger the original neural pathways laid down during the fixation experience. This explains why relationship triggers can provoke emotional responses that seem wildly disproportionate to the current situation. These fixations become particularly powerful in romantic relationships because of what Freud called transference, the unconscious projection of early relationship patterns onto current relationships. While transference occurs in all relationships, romantic partnerships activate it most intensely because they involve vulnerability, dependency, and emotional intimacy, similar to early caregiver relationships. The concept of emotional templates from attachment theory parallels Freud's fixation theory. These templates form based on early experiences with caregivers and create unconscious expectations about how relationships work. A secure template allows for trust and vulnerability, while insecure templates create specific defensive patterns, anxious pursuit, avoidant withdrawal, or disorganized oscillation between the two. What distinguishes fixation theory is its emphasis on specific experiences rather than general relationship patterns. While attachment theory focuses on the overall quality of caregiving, fixation theory suggests that singular emotionally charged events can create lasting imprints regardless of the general relationship context. A generally secure child who experiences one profound betrayal or loss may develop a specific fixation around that experience despite otherwise healthy attachment. The power of these singular experiences comes from what psychologists call emotional encoding. Experiences accompanied by intense emotion create stronger, more lasting neural connections than neutral experiences. The brain essentially flags emotionally significant events as especially important to remember, creating preferential storage of both the event and the emotional response it generated. This explains why seemingly minor childhood incidents sometimes create greater impact than more obviously significant ones. A parent forgetting to attend a school play might objectively seem less significant than a divorce. But if it happened to trigger intense shame or abandonment fear at a crucial developmental moment, it could create a more powerful fixation than the objectively bigger event that the child had more resources to process. Cultural and familial messages intensify these individual experiences. A child who experiences rejection in a family context where self-sufficiency is prized and vulnerability is shamed will likely develop a more significant fixation than one whose family helps process and contextualize the experience. Culture similarly amplifies or mitigates the impact of specific experiences based on the meanings attached to them. Gender plays a particular role in how these fixations develop and manifest. Boys and girls often receive different messages about how to respond to similar emotional experiences. A boy told, "Don't cry," after a loss learns to suppress awareness of the fixation, even as it continues operating unconsciously. A girl told that caretaking is her natural role may develop a more conscious fixation around rescuing or fixing partners. The insidious aspect of these fixations is how they create self-fulfilling prophecies. The woman fixated on abandonment unconsciously selects partners likely to leave and behaves in ways that increase that likelihood. The man fixated on control chooses partners who challenge his autonomy, confirming his belief that relationships threaten independence. These patterns feel like external reality rather than co-created dynamics. What makes romantic fixations particularly resistant to change is their connection to pleasure and desire. While consciously painful, these patterns often create unconscious satisfaction by offering the illusion of mastering the original trauma. The repetition creates what analysts call repetition compulsion, an unconscious attempt to gain control over painful experiences by reenacting them, like returning to the scene of an accident. The sexual dimension adds another layer of reinforcement. Sexual attraction often becomes neurologically linked to our fixation patterns, creating powerful erotic responses to potential partners who trigger our particular dynamic. This explains the common experience of feeling strong chemistry with exactly the wrong people, those who will recreate our core wounds rather than help heal them. Understanding these patterns requires distinguishing between the presenting problem and the underlying fixation. A woman who consistently chooses unfaithful partners might identify jealousy as her issue, when the underlying fixation involves a childhood experience of having to compete for a parent's attention. A man who feels smothered by partners' emotional needs might identify independence as his value, when his fixation actually involves fear of dependency created by early experience of unreliable care. These misidentifications explain why common relationship advice often fails. Addressing the symptomatic behavior, being more trusting, communicating more directly, establishing better boundaries, doesn't resolve the underlying fixation driving the pattern. The conscious mind implements the advice, while the unconscious continues operating according to its own emotional logic. Breaking these patterns requires identifying the specific fixation moment or experience. This isn't always a dramatic trauma. Often, it's a subtle moment that wouldn't even register as significant to an outside observer. The look on a parent's face when the child failed at something, the quiet withdrawal of affection following a child's expression of anger, the comparison to a sibling that landed with particular weight at a vulnerable moment. Accessing these memories often requires indirect approaches. Direct questioning typically activates the conscious mind, which has its own narrative about our patterns that may bear little relationship to the actual fixation. Dreams, free association, body-centered approaches, and examining emotional triggers in current relationships often provide clearer pathways to identifying the original fixation point. Once identified, healing involves several key processes. The first is conscious recognition, acknowledging the specific experience that created the fixation and how it continues influencing current relationship patterns. This isn't generic insight, "My parents affected my relationships," but specific understanding of how a particular experience created a particular pattern. The second process involves emotional release, accessing and expressing the emotions associated with the original experience that couldn't be processed at the time. This might involve grief for what was lost, anger at those who failed to protect, or fear that was too overwhelming to fully feel. These emotions, stored in the body and implicit memory, need discharge before new patterns can develop. The third element involves creating corrective experiences that contradict the lessons of the fixation. If the fixation taught that vulnerability leads to rejection, healing requires experiences of vulnerability met with acceptance. If it taught that love is earned through performance, healing requires experiences of being valued regardless of achievement. These new experiences gradually create alternative neural pathways that can eventually override the fixation pattern. Romantic relationships themselves can provide contexts for healing, but typically only when we choose partners capable of providing these corrective experiences rather than those who reinforce our fixations. This creates a challenging paradox. We need healthy relationships to heal our fixations, but our fixations draw us toward unhealthy relationships. Breaking this cycle usually requires conscious override of our automatic attraction patterns. This doesn't mean choosing partners we feel no attraction toward, but rather distinguishing between chemistry based on genuine compatibility versus chemistry based on fixation triggers. The former involves attraction to qualities that actually support healthy relationships, while the latter creates intense but ultimately painful connections that repeat our fixation patterns. Friends and therapists often see our patterns more clearly than we do, noticing how we repeatedly choose similar partners or create similar relationship dynamics despite our stated desires for something different. Their observations, while sometimes uncomfortable to hear, provide valuable external perspective on patterns our fixations render invisible to us. Professional support often proves essential in this process. Therapists trained in psychodynamic approaches, EMDR, somatic experiencing, internal family systems, or other modalities that address unconscious patterns can help identify fixation points and create conditions for their resolution. The therapeutic relationship itself becomes a laboratory for exploring how the fixation manifests in current relationships. Physical approaches play a crucial role because fixations don't exist only in the mind, but in the body's response systems. The nervous system, trained by early experiences to associate certain relationship dynamics with threat or safety, requires retraining through new embodied experiences. Somatic therapies that address these physiological patterns complement cognitive understanding in creating lasting change. Cultural and social support systems significantly influence healing possibilities. Communities that normalize psychological growth, that understand relationships as contexts for healing rather than just sources of validation or status, provide crucial support for the vulnerable work of addressing fixations. Conversely, social contexts that reinforce fixation patterns through their values and expectations create additional barriers to change. The most hopeful aspect of understanding fixation theory is recognizing that what feels like an immutable aspect of our personality, whom we're attracted to, how we behave in relationships, what feels normal or comfortable, actually represents a specific psychological adaptation that can change. Our current patterns aren't who we fundamentally are, but who we became in response to particular experiences. This understanding challenges the concept of fixed types in relationships. You don't have an innate preference for unavailable partners or controlling ones. You have a fixation created by specific experiences that created specific neural and psychological patterns. As these patterns heal, your attractions and relationship behaviors naturally shift toward healthier dynamics. The healing process moves through predictable stages, though rarely in a linear progression. It begins with unconscious reenactment of the fixation pattern, progresses through conscious awareness of the pattern without ability to change it, then advances to conscious intervention in the pattern, and finally develops into new automatic responses that no longer require conscious override. This final stage represents true healing of the fixation. Throughout this process, compassion for both ourselves and those who participated in creating our fixations proves essential. The parent who created a fixation through their failure, absence, intrusiveness, or other harmful behavior was likely acting from their own fixations and limitations. Understanding this doesn't excuse harm, but places it in a context that allows for healing rather than continued resentment. Self-compassion involves recognizing that our fixation patterns, however problematic they've proven in our relationships, represented our best attempt to manage painful early experiences. The child who developed a fixation around emotional abandonment wasn't making a mistake, but creating a necessary psychological adaptation to an overwhelming experience. Healing involves honoring the adaptive purpose these patterns served, while developing new responses better suited to adult relationships. The ultimate message of fixation theory isn't deterministic, but empowering. While early experiences profoundly shape our relationship patterns, understanding these influences creates the possibility of choice. What operated as unconscious compulsion becomes available for conscious decision once we recognize the specific childhood experiences that still control our dating life. This recognition doesn't create instant change, but initiates a process of gradual transformation. Each time we identify a fixation pattern activating in current relationships, each time we make even a small choice different from our automatic response, we strengthen new neural pathways and weaken the hold of the original fixation. Over time, what required conscious effort becomes natural, as new patterns replace those created by the childhood experiences that no longer need to control our romantic future.